Welcome to Inglit Mirror. Today, we analyze the slave narrative, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. The British Library says, an enslaved man who bought his freedom and wrote compellingly about his experiences. Olaudah Equiano was an extraordinary man who became a prominent figure associated with the campaign to abolish the slave trade. Let's look at the work. Equiano, who was also known as Gustavus Vasa, although this was not his birth name, was born around 1745 in what is now the Ibo region of Nigeria. In his autobiography, he calls the area Ezeka. It was then a part of the Abyssinian Empire. Equiano's father was a village elder and a slave owner, but after the fashion of the country, he was a kind master. By his own account, Equiano was brought up in a condition of rural simplicity and happiness with his siblings. His home was removed from the upheavals that were shaking Europe, the Indian subcontinent, and North America during the second half of the 18th century, when the civilized world was reorganizing itself dramatically. In the early description of his childhood, Equiano notes that his village society had little use for money and stresses the high standards of virtue, cleanliness, abstemiousness, and decency they obtained there. In this, he opposes the conventional images of savagery, such as we find in Robinson Crusoe, where the natives are bloodthirsty cannibals. When he was about 11 years old, Equiano was kidnapped while playing with his sister and carried off to be a slave. The description of his capture gives a good idea of the overlays of high Augustinism in his literary style, and at the same time, the extraordinarily powerful and moving tale he has to tell. Initially, Equiano was an African slave among his own people, but he was ultimately taken to the coast and put aboard a slave ship. His first encounter with white people inspires one of the most vivid sections in the narrative. He assumes the white monsters are cannibals and fears they will eat him. It is they who are the inhuman savages, not Equiano. He faints from shock, fear, and despair. The description of the middle passage is the most affecting and horrifying in the book. The stench and noise are overwhelming, and Equiano becomes sick as he writes, I now wished for the last friend, death, to relieve me. For white traders in black human cargo, slavery was a profitable and necessary in economic terms line of international commerce. At the time of the American Revolution, British forces were moved to the West Indies to protect the plantations there, which were worked by black slaves from the French. The calculation was made in London that the plantations of these islands were worth more to the crown than what would eventually become the United States of America. What made the West Indian colonial properties so valuable was slave labor, which produced the sugar and other commodities for which there was a huge demand in Europe. Thus, the financial base of British Empire was built on human exploitation. Equiano was sold a number of times, eventually purchased by white slavers and transported to Barbados. He ultimately found himself in the colony of Virginia, where he was bought by a Royal Navy officer, Michael Pascal. Pascal renamed his slave Gustavus Vasa in honor of Gustavus I, the King of Sweden, who had been to some extent a liberator of that country. The irony here seems to have escaped Pascal. Equiano was the personal slave of Pascal and thus traveled extensively. He became a trained, able-bodied seamen under the royal flag of England and fought the French manning the ship's guns. Equiano endeared himself by loyal service to his master. When they made port in England, Pascal sent him to school to learn how to read and write in English. Clever as well as good-natured, Equiano learned English better than most of the English population at the time. Pascal's actions were highly unusual and generally considered by slave owners to be dangerous. Literacy was like a sword or a knife, an edged tool. It rendered slaves restless, discontent with their load, and potentially rebellious. During this period, Equiano also became a devout Christian and persuaded his master to allow him be baptized so that he might go to heaven. Church registers record that Equiano was duly baptized in a church near Westminster in February 1759. Heaven might be possible for Equiano when he died, but freedom in life wasn't, nor was he given his share of the money from captured ships, which was usually divided among the crew. Equiano was inevitably sold yet again, this time into the Caribbean, though jewel in England's imperial crown. Equiano possessed remarkable skills. He could read and write English and, if necessary, navigate a ship. Given his abilities, he was too valuable to work under the overseas whip in the sugar fields. He gives us a graphic first-hand account of the extraordinary mixture not merely of brutality and callousness, but of calculation and commercial ruthlessness with which the slave trade was conducted, particularly in the British West Indies. This was the most profitable and extreme of the slave-driving colonies. Its inhuman practices were actually written into law as the West India Code. Under this code, no plantation owner could be held guilty for whatever he chose to do to his slaves. And as Equiano tells us, these slaves might easily be his own children. Equiano also gives us a beautifully written and poignant description of the parting of slave husbands and wives, children and parents as they were sold off to other islands. Reading his autobiography, we get the sense that Equiano is much more human than his owners. Slavery, he intimates, brutalizes the slavers more than it brutalizes the slaves. In 1765, when he was around 20 years old, Equiano was bought by a Quaker merchant, Robert King of Philadelphia, who had many uses for Equiano's unusual abilities, principally in matters of inventory. The Quakers were an enlightened sect, and King promised that if Equiano could repay his $40 purchase price, he would receive his freedom. A good master by the standards of the time, King further educated Equiano, instructed him in the Christian faith, and enabled him by trading to earn the necessary sum for his freedom. Equiano resolved that it would be unwise to remain in the American colonies as a freed black man. Such men were at risk and generally resented. Equiano was almost caught himself and carried off again to be a slave in the southern region of the colonies. Equiano was an accomplished merchant or trader in his own right. He traded for a number of years, possibly even in slaves, before he allied himself with the emergent abolitionist movement in England. This movement was sponsored by evangelicals, nonconformists, and Quakers, whose idiom Equiano knew well. Women were also a major force in the abolitionist movement in Britain as well as in America. Now, in England, Equiano gave speeches and preached. He also married. in 1792, an Englishwoman, Susanna Cullen. He became a leading figure in the abolitionist movement, not by virtue of having suffered, but by virtue of being able to articulate the suffering of slaves with great eloquence and literary skill. It was Equiano who publicized the case of the slave ship called Zong, in which 133 slaves were thrown overboard to drown in their chains for the insurance money. In 1789, with the help of patrons, Equiano published his great work, the interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano. The book enjoyed lively sales and set Equiano up for life. It was the first important slave narrative in English literature with a style of evocative of Dr. Johnson and the Augustines. Recent scholarship has rendered parts of Equiano's autobiography dubious. It has been suggested, although this is a matter of great dispute, that he might have been born in the American colonies in what is now South Carolina. This debate may be worth conducting in the context of Equiano's insistence that his story is genuine. From the point at which he becomes Pascal's slave, however, Equiano's experiences can be authenticated by documentary record. Even if the early descriptions of his childhood are second-hand, those descriptions were true for thousands of others taken by force from Africa to work in the British colonies. Equiano's married life was evidently happy, and he became a celebrity in England. His success in middle age may have served as some compensation for the suffering that had been inflicted on him earlier. His marriage resulted in 2 daughters, but his wife Susanna died in 1796 at just age 34, and Equiano followed her a year later, probably at about age 52. It is not known where he is buried, although he did leave a sizable fortune to his surviving daughter. Britain has appropriated Olaudah Equiano for English literature, although many anthologies include him as an American writer by virtue of his long periods of enslavement in that country. Of course, by origin, and as the early sections of his history make clear, he is a Nigerian writer. Thank you for watching this video. If you like the video, please share and subscribe.